Welcome everyone, good morning, good evening and good afternoon. Today is Monday, it's the start of a new week. We are getting even closer to the release of Dragonflight, and now we are finally entering that very nice and juicy part of the pre-release of an expansion where we can start talking about the meta. We can start talking about popular specs, we can start talking about what to play in the next expansion, what's gonna be the main pick for Mythic Plus, the main pick for the raid, what you should look out for, etc, etc. Because now we are close enough, we are basically 20 days away from the expansion, so we can start, deciding, we can start picking how exactly the specs are looking so far. This is the same process we have had before the release of Shadowlands, where by now, by a month to 20 days before the release, we could see in the beta from the testing that specs like Fire Mage, specs like Marksmanship Hunter, like Unholy Death Knight, like Vengeance Demon Hunter, Holy Paladin were looking very powerful. So players knew, they were preparing themselves to pick these particular specs because they were strong, they looked strong in the beta. So now we are starting to get the same treatment, the same movement in the beta of Dragonflight, with certain specs appearing quite powerful. So we are starting for today by looking at the number one spec, of the more powerful at the moment spec when it comes to tanks, because for today we have Protection Warrior. I looked at which specs to start with, and I decided that Protection Warrior, given the very sad state Protection has received in Shadowlands, they went from being a decent tank at the start of Battle for Azeroth and then a very good tank in the middle to end of Battle for Azeroth into complete obscurity in Shadowlands. They literally did not catch a break in Shadowlands. They have been overshadowed by at the very least 3 to 4 tanks at any given time throughout the expansion. So it's a good upset for Dragonflight if Protection Warrior were to come back at being quite powerful, and at the moment it definitely is. It is the strongest tank available at the moment. Now, disclaimer, Blizzard just a couple of days ago added the plus 40% health to all players and plus 40% all damage done to all mobs, all creatures. So we had a video on it, and as we explained there, it might impact quite a lot on how tanks are working, but at the moment, even with those changes, Warrior was one of the least affected, together with Vengeance and with Blood Death Knight. Warrior is looking very, very good. So let's just go and take a look at what makes it so great. This is not going to be as much of a difference, as much of a foreign explanation to all of you guys, because unlike Shadowlands, we have no borrowed powers. So when you were in BFA, you were seeing videos and explanations from the beta, and in the beta of BFA you had things like Azerite traits, for example, that were changing the way a spec played. In Shadowlands, in the beta of Shadowlands, you had things like conduits, you had things like covenant abilities, you had things like legendaries, which were changing a lot. So even if you had the new reworked talents in the pre-patch, you were still missing a lot. Meanwhile, in the pre-patch of Dragonflight, you have quite a lot already. In fact, you have so much that you can already see in things like these, in the results right now, how Warrior out of nowhere jumped out to be the most powerful tank in the pre-patch already. But maybe some things might change in Dragonflight. With the 10 extra talent points we are getting by getting to level 70, and with the tier set bonuses, a lot might change, perhaps. So let's start immediately, let's just cut to the chase, let's keep the minor things for later and just immediately talk about what is making Protection Warrior so powerful at the moment. And for the record, I'm saying it is too powerful, and I'm also saying it will very likely be nerfed, because at the moment this power is just unsustainable. So the power of Protection Warrior comes from these 4 things, which put together basically form EXODIA. So you have this talent in the general tree of Warrior, Leeching Strikes, which gives you 5% leech. That's already a decent start. Leech is very good, it's very worthwhile for both healers and tanks in particular. Then you have further specialization into leeching, because one-handed weapon spec in the general tree of Warrior also gives you 5% more leech. And then you have one of the few things you're still missing from the pre-patch, your tier set. the tier set bonus of Protection Warrior, the 4-piece set bonus. During Vanguard's Determination, which is a buff that you gain for 5 seconds after casting Revenge, which should be active often enough, you refresh your Ignore Pain Absorb Shield equal to 5% of the damage you deal. These 3 already are decent enough, they are decent power-ups, but what really makes it all come together is Brutal Vitality. This talent makes you convert 30% of the damage you deal and add that damage to your absorb of Ignore Pain. Now you have 5% of the damage you're doing added to Ignore Pain because of the tier set, an extra 30% because of Brutal Vitality, so you have 35% of your DPS, a third or so of your DPS is transformed into HPS, basically, and then you have 10% more leech from your general tree, which also translates to 10% of the damage you do heals you. So, with the 35% of the absorb shielding and the 10% of leech, this translates into a Prot Warrior nearly healing for 50% of the damage it's doing. This is very, very good, of course, because, for example, one of the weaknesses of tanks can be that they are very good at dealing with armor, they are very good at dealing with physical damage, but they are very weak at dealing with magical damage. You know, they have a big weakness there. Protection Warrior doesn't have that issue because Ignore Pain, of course, is an absorb shield and it can absorb magical damage as well. And if you have leech, if you have heal yourself for the damage you do, healing is dealing with any sort of damage. It doesn't matter if the damage is physical, it's magical, it's a dot, it's a reflected damage, you are healing it. So you're healing no matter what type of damage you are taking, which makes it very, very good for tanks. This talent in particular, Brutal Vitality, is so powerful because it warps your entire talent tree. Basically, in every single talent you look at in the Protection Warrior setup, you can add a parenthesis at the bottom which reads, and heals you for 30% of the damage it does. You know, you are taking Thunderclap, you are taking synergy and extra damage with Thunderclap. That is also going to heal you for more. You are taking Ravager. Ravager now is also going to heal you for 30% of the damage it does. You're taking things like Thunderous Roar, you're taking things like Spear of Bastion. Those are also going to heal you for 30% of the damage they do because of this talent right here. This is what makes it very, very powerful for a tank. Not just because it's good to do more damage as a tank, in particular in Mythic Plus, but because now it can be used as a defensive for Protection Warrior. But that's not just all of the power that Protection Warrior has. There is a whole second layer of power that you can get. Things like Demo Shout, which is still there to reduce the damage the enemies deal by 25%, plus Thunderlord to further reduce the cooldown of Demo Shout to make it available more often, is paired with a brand new, although we should say returning, ability like Defensive Stance. This is an on-demand 20% damage reduction, which is insane for a tank. Yes, you have to pay the tax, you have to do 10% less damage to make this active, but a 20% on-demand damage reduction ability with no cooldown, basically 3-second cooldown, is very, very powerful. Just with Demo Shout plus Defensive Stance, the enemies are doing 45% less damage to you, and you are also healing for nearly 50% of all the damage you are doing, which makes you incredibly, incredibly tanky. And also to all types of damage, because as we said, Ignore Pain works with any type of damage. It's not just things like Demon Spikes or Iron Fur or things like Bone Shield, which just deals with armor. The ways of healing for Prot Warrior are very, very good for magical damage as well. Lastly, there is an extra improvement for Protection Warrior with Crowd Control. Because this expansion in Dragonflight, Protection Warrior will have access to Stormbolt, which is a single target stun, and then you have Shockwave, talented with Rumbling Earth, to basically turn into a 25-second cooldown AoE stun. But that's not all, because you have Disrupting Shout, which is a 90-second AoE silence that Warrior has. It's the unique class now and spec that has access to this AoE silence for 6 seconds up to all enemies in the range, which is very, very good. And then Shield Charge. Shield Charge basically took Reprisal, which was a very powerful and very strong legendary for Protection Warriors, but they did not like that it was tied to Charge and it was tied to Intervene because they were utility abilities and you didn't want to use them for this power gain, and they just made it its own ability, which is now also going to stun the primary target for 4 seconds. So Protection Warrior has access to 2 different types of single target stuns, plus they have access to an AoE stun, plus an AoE silence, and also they still have Intimidating Shout for the AoE fear. This totals out to be a lot of crowd control for a tank. Then you add the defensive layers that they have. I just talked about these decent to good defensive layers. I haven't even mentioned Last Stand. I haven't even mentioned Shield Wall as defensives. You have extra pretty good power-ups like Avatar. You know, before you read Avatar as a 20% more damage, and then you take Unstoppable Force to make Thunderclap deal 50% more damage inside of Avatar, which was good to do damage. But then you tie this talent to your ability to heal yourself for 45% of the damage you're doing, and now Avatar becomes a legitimate, on its own, standalone, very good defensive ability, because you get to heal much more thanks to the damage, the increased damage you're doing thanks to Avatar. So altogether, it makes Protection Warrior very, very strong. This doesn't even include other things like, for example, Battle Shout as the AP buff to the party and the raid, or Rallying Cry, the raid cooldown, the very good raid cooldown that you still have as a warrior. All of this combined has currently made Protection Warrior the strongest tank. When you look at this, you see a Prot Warrior taking 48 million damage throughout a key in Mythic Plus and then healing himself for 35 million damage, which means 2/3 of the damage they are taking, it's completely dealt with by the Prot Warrior himself. You can even go in keys where there is not even fortified, but it's tyrannical, so there is much less trash damage, much less damage from big packs, where the Protection Warrior is just healing himself without help. This is just a solo plus 15 key done by the warrior with no help needed from the healer. And this doesn't include all the block, all the damage prevented from the blocks of Protection Warrior. So it has currently made Protection Warrior to be the strongest of the tanks, and this is with an eye in particular for Mythic Plus. The amount of crowd control they can bring, the extra helpful utility like Battle Shout and like Rallying Cry, but more importantly the extra defensiveness they have gotten in this expansion, the combos of the strong cooldowns to do damage that can now turn into defensive cooldowns because you have a very powerful talent like Brutal Vitality, which was previously nerfed to 10% of the damage you dealt turned into an Absorb Shield of your Ignore Pain, and then suddenly buffed back up to 30%, which has now currently brought back Protection Warrior to be the strongest of the tanks. This is why, if you were to ask me about give a ranking, give a tier list, the classic tier list before an expansion, which we will make eventually, but if you were to ask me now about which of the tanks would you see becoming meta in the first season of Dragonflight, I would tell you Blood Death Knight and Vengeance are first, and then there is Protection Warrior somewhere in the same level of Master Monk, and then at the bottom there is Prot Paladin, and even lower down Guardian Druid. Now you would be asking, wait a second, we just had a full video praising the powers of Protection Warrior. That's because the power of Protection Warrior at the moment is so high that it is the prime suspect, the sole lead that Blizzard currently has to direct their nerf bat at. So it makes it more likely that Protection Warrior, being so much above the rest at the moment, is going to be the one to be nerfed and therefore be made worse by the 2 tanks I mentioned like Blood Death Knight and Vengeance Demon Hunter. That's my current take on the state of the tanks. Even if you were a Prot Warrior yourself, even if you were thinking about rolling a Prot Warrior yourself, you should probably hope for a slight set of nerfs, you know, just in time before Blizzard just guts the spec before the expansion, or even worse, just 1 or 2 weeks into the expansion. You don't want to overdo it, okay? You don't want to barge in, big dick swinging, being the absolute meta flavor of the month tank, 30% stronger than anyone else. It's perhaps better if you get a slight adjustment now. As I said, brutal vitality is far too much damage turned into ignore pain. It is 100% going to be nerfed. It's just a matter of how much. If it's gonna be brought down to 25%, you should be super happy. If it's gonna be brought down to 20%, you should be still very good, with Prot being still very good at the release of the expansion. If it goes down to 15%, it's gonna depend. If it goes down back to 10%, then you're back to being average, I would say, perhaps below average, it depends, but either way it is likely going to be adjusted before the release of the expansion. That's why I wanted to start with Prot Warrior, because at the moment, if we had to look at all of the roles and all of the specs, it's perhaps the one that stands out the most because of how much better it is. So with this first overview to Protection Warrior, to our first spec being a tank for our overview before the release of the expansion, we are stopping here. Hoping, of course, that the sure-to-be incoming set of nerfs to Protection Warrior won't be too harsh, I'm going to leave you to the rest of your worst day of the week. Thanks, of course, starting as usual with my Patreon supporters. Your contribution and your support are a big part in what allows me to continue to produce WoW content for all of you to hopefully enjoy. You can still support in other ways that don't include having to abuse your wallet, which are liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Those are still quite simple to do. It's just a handful of clicks. It's not that traumatizing to do. And lastly, for more social interactions and general parasocial relationships with your imaginary online friends, you can follow me on Twitter, as well as subscribing to my Patreon right around these two links right there. With this said and done, it's time to leave each other. Thank you guys again for watching. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, we had like 2 to 3 days of quite cold weather around here. It was good enough to wear heavy clothing, but now, you know, I'm not saying I'm sweating. I'm not saying it's hot. It's not, but not quite my tempo.